The blood-red sun dipped below the horizon as Grace Sinclair clutched her medical bag tighter, riding her mare at a punishing pace across the Montana territory. She had less than an hour before nightfall would make the mountain trail treacherous, but Mrs. Patterson's baby wouldn't wait for daylight. Montana Territory, 1878. The spring had been unusually wet, turning the normally lazy Blackwater Creek into a swollen, angry beast that cut through the valley like a serpent's tongue. But Grace had crossed it hundreds of times, and tonight would be no different. "Just a bit further, Willow," she encouraged her horse, feeling the first fat raindrops splash against her cheeks. The sky had turned an ominous purple-black, and thunder rumbled in the distance. Grace hadn't anticipated a storm when she'd left town 3 hours earlier, responding to the urgent message that Eliza Patterson had gone into labor with her 5th child a month early. The trail narrowed as it approached the creek crossing. In daylight, the ford was clearly marked by large stones that provided safe passage. But as darkness fell and rain began to pelt down harder, Grace could barely make out the path ahead. She slowed Willow to a careful walk, squinting through the increasing downpour. A flash of lightning illuminated the scene before her, and Grace's heart nearly stopped. The creek had become a raging torrent, at least 3 times its normal width, churning brown water carrying debris downstream at an alarming rate. "Lord have mercy," she whispered, pulling Willow to a halt. She had 2 choices: attempt to cross the dangerous waters or turn back and find another route to the Patterson homestead, which would add hours to her journey. Hours that Eliza and her baby might not have. Grace took a deep breath. "Come on, girl," she said, guiding Willow toward what she hoped was the shallowest part of the crossing. The mare stepped tentatively into the water, which immediately rose to her knees. Grace felt the powerful current pushing against them, but Willow was sturdy and sure-footed. They were nearly halfway across when a massive tree branch came hurtling downstream, slamming into Willow's flank. The horse whinnied in terror, rearing up. Grace clung desperately to the saddle, but another surge of water knocked them sideways. Before she could process what was happening, she was thrown into the icy current, her medical bag still clutched in her hand. "Willow," she screamed, watching her horse struggle to the far bank before disappearing into the darkness. The current dragged Grace downstream, her sodden skirts weighing her down like an anchor. She fought to keep her head above water, gasping for air whenever the churning river allowed. Her fingers were numb, but she refused to release her medical bag. Those supplies could mean life or death for Eliza. A jagged rock tore through her sleeve, slicing her arm. The pain was immediate and sharp, but it was nothing compared to the burning in her lungs as she struggled to breathe between waves. Just as her strength began to fail, her foot struck something solid, a sandbar, perhaps, or a fallen tree beneath the water's surface. She pushed off with all her might, managing to get her head above water long enough to gulp down precious air. "Help," she called out, though she knew it was futile. The Patterson place was still a mile away, and no one would be out in this storm. The river carried her around a bend, and suddenly, Grace felt herself being lifted not by the water, but by strong hands that gripped her firmly under her arms. She was hoisted up onto the bank, coughing and sputtering, still somehow clutching her medical bag. "I've got you," a deep voice said close to her ear. "Hold on." Through water-blurred vision, she made out the silhouette of a man tall and broad-shouldered, wearing what appeared to be a wide-brimmed hat. He knelt beside her, his face coming into focus as lightning flashed again. He couldn't have been more than 30, with dark eyes that reflected concern and a strong jawline shadowed with stubble. "Thank you," Grace managed between coughs, water streaming from her hair and clothes. "You picked a hell of a night for a swim," he said, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly. "Are you hurt?" "My arm," she said, suddenly remembering the gash. "But I need to get to the Patterson homestead. Eliza Patterson is in labor." His expression changed immediately. "You're the doctor." "Midwife," she corrected, struggling to her feet. "Grace Sinclair." "Daniel Blackburn," he replied, steadying her with a hand on her elbow. "I've got my horse tied just up the bank. The Patterson place is about a mile north." "I know where it is," Grace said, swaying slightly. I just need to. Daniel caught her as her knees buckled. Without a word, he swept her up into his arms. You're not walking anywhere in your condition, he said firmly, and that river's rising by the minute. We need to move. Grace wanted to protest, but the truth was she could barely stand. Her medical bag weighed heavy in her grip, water still dripping from the leather. My supplies, we'll see what can be salvaged, he said, carrying her up the muddy embankment to where a large buckskin stallion stood patiently under a pine tree. But first, we need to get you somewhere warm. He set her down gently next to the horse, then removed his duster and draped it over her shoulders. It was wonderfully warm from his body heat, and Grace clutched it gratefully around herself. Can you ride? He asked, eyeing her critically. Of course, she replied, though in truth she wasn't certain her frozen limbs would cooperate. Daniel nodded, clearly unconvinced. He mounted the buckskin in one fluid motion, then reached down and with surprising strength lifted Grace up to sit in front of him. One arm wrapped securely around her waist while the other held the reins. My horse, Grace said suddenly. She bolted when we were crossing. If she made it out, she'll head home, Daniel assured her. Smart animals, horses. He clicked his tongue, and the buckskin moved forward, picking its way carefully along the muddy trail. Grace was acutely aware of the solid warmth of the stranger at her back, the steady rhythm of his breathing a counterpoint to the pounding rain. Her body ached, and the cut on her arm stung fiercely, but all she could think about was Eliza Patterson and her unborn child. How do you know the Pattersons? She asked, partly to distract herself from the pain and partly out of genuine curiosity about this man who had appeared out of nowhere to rescue her. I don't, he replied. I'm passing through on my way to Helena, got caught in the storm and was looking for shelter when I heard you call out. Lucky for me, Grace murmured. His chest rumbled against her back in what might have been a chuckle. Luck had nothing to do with it. Anyone would have done the same, but Grace knew that wasn't true. The territory was full of men who wouldn't have risked their necks to save a stranger from the river. You're bleeding, Daniel observed, nodding toward her arm where a dark stain was spreading through her torn sleeve. It's not deep, she assured him, though she hadn't actually had a chance to examine the wound properly. We'll clean it at the Patterson place, he said, his tone brooking no argument. They rode in silence for several minutes, the only sounds the steady drumming of rain and the occasional rumble of thunder. The storm was moving past them now, heading east, but the rain showed no sign of letting up. Finally, a flickering light appeared through the trees, a lantern hanging on the porch of a sturdy log cabin. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, and as they approached, the front door flew open. Miss Sinclair, a man called out, rushing down the steps. It was Tom Patterson, his face drawn with worry. We'd nearly given up hope. He stopped short when he saw Daniel. Who's this? Daniel Blackburn, Grace replied, wincing as Daniel helped her down from the horse. He pulled me from the creek. The crossing was flooded and Willow and I got swept away. Tom's eyes widened. Good Lord, are you all right? I'm fine, Grace insisted, clutching her medical bag. How's Eliza? Not good, Tom said, his voice dropping. The pains are coming fast now and she's getting weaker. Grace nodded, immediately shifting into her professional role despite her own discomfort. Let's not waste any more time then. Tom led them inside, where the cabin's single main room was lit by oil lamps and a roaring fire in the hearth. 3 small children huddled together in a corner, wide-eyed and frightened. From behind a quilt hung as a makeshift partition came the unmistakable sounds of a woman in labor. Children, go to the loft, Tom instructed gently. Miss Sinclair is here to help your mama now. As the children obediently climbed the ladder to the sleeping loft, Grace turned to Daniel. I need to change into something dry and see to Eliza, he nodded. I'll tend to the horse and bring in more firewood. Grace ducked behind the quilt partition, where Eliza Patterson lay on the bed, her face pale and beaded with sweat. The young woman's eyes lit up when she saw Grace. You came, she whispered, reaching out a trembling hand. Of course I came, Grace replied, setting her medical bag down and opening it. Thankfully, the oilcloth lining had kept most of her instruments and supplies dry. Now, let's bring this baby into the world, shall we? Outside, Daniel unsaddled his horse and led it to the small lean-to that served as the Pattersons' barn. The animal would have to share space with the family's milk cow and 2 goats, but it would be dry at least. As he worked, Daniel found himself thinking about the midwife. Grace Sinclair wasn't what he'd expected when he'd heard a woman calling for help in the river. Most women would have been hysterical after such an ordeal, but she'd remained focused on her patient even while shivering and bleeding. He gathered an armful of firewood from the covered pile next to the barn and headed back to the cabin. Inside, Tom Patterson paced nervously, stopping only to glance at the partition when Eliza's cries grew particularly loud. "Is there anything I can do?" Daniel asked, setting the wood beside the hearth. Tom ran a hand through his hair. "Not unless you know something about birthing babies." Daniel smiled grimly. "Afraid not, but I can make coffee if you've got any." "That'd be welcome," Tom said with a nod toward a shelf where a tin of coffee sat next to a battered pot. Daniel busied himself with brewing coffee, keeping one ear tuned to the sounds from behind the partition. Occasionally, he heard Grace's calm, reassuring voice, though he couldn't make out her words. An hour passed, then another. The rain continued to drum on the roof, and the children in the loft had long since fallen asleep. It was well past midnight when a new sound cut through the cabin, the thin, angry wail of a newborn. Tom leapt to his feet, his face transformed by hope. A few moments later, Grace emerged from behind the partition, her sleeves rolled up and a small bundle in her arms. "You have another daughter, Mr. Patterson," she said, her exhaustion evident in the shadows under her eyes but her smile radiant. "She's small, but she's strong." Tom took the swaddled infant with trembling hands, tears streaming unashamedly down his face. "And Eliza, resting," Grace replied. "She lost more blood than I'd like, but she'll recover with proper care." She swayed slightly on her feet, and Daniel was at her side in an instant, a steadying hand on her elbow. "You need to sit down," he said quietly. This time she didn't argue. She allowed him to guide her to a chair by the fire, where she sank down with a grateful sigh. In the flickering light, Daniel could see that someone, presumably Eliza, had lent her a clean, dry dress, though her damp hair still hung in loose waves around her shoulders. "Let me see that arm now," he said, kneeling beside her. Grace looked as though she might protest, but then nodded wearily. "There's iodine in my bag." Daniel retrieved the medical bag and found the small brown bottle. Under his careful ministrations, Grace winced but remained still as he cleaned the gash, which thankfully wasn't as deep as he'd feared. "You've done this before," she observed. He nodded. "Army trained, served as a medic during the last years of the war. You fought for the Union?" "Yes, madam." Something in his tone must have warned her not to pursue that line of questioning further, because she simply said, "Thank you," as he finished wrapping a clean bandage around her arm. Tom returned from behind the partition, his newborn daughter still cradled in his arms. "Eliza wants to see you, Miss Sinclair." Grace nodded and stood, her professional mask sliding back into place. "I'll check her bleeding and make sure she's comfortable for the night." As she disappeared behind the quilt again, Tom turned to Daniel. "I don't know how to thank you for bringing her here. If anything had happened to Eliza or the baby." He trailed off, unable to complete the thought. "Miss Sinclair deserves the credit," Daniel said honestly. "She was determined to get here even after nearly drowning." Tom nodded. "She's a remarkable woman. Came out here from Boston 3 years ago after her fiancé died. Started tending to folks when the nearest doctor is a 2-day ride away." He looked down at his sleeping daughter. "This little one makes 15 babies she's delivered in the valley." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "She's made quite an impact." "That she has," Tom agreed, "though not everyone appreciates having a woman doing men's work, as some put it." Daniel had heard such sentiments before and had seen firsthand during the war how capable women could be when given the chance. He'd served under a female doctor at a field hospital in Virginia who could amputate a limb faster and cleaner than most male surgeons. Grace emerged again from behind the partition, looking even more exhausted than before. "Eliza is sleeping now," she told Tom. The bleeding has slowed, but I'll need to stay the night to monitor her and the baby. Of course, Tom replied. I'll make up a pallet by the fire. I should go, Daniel said, reaching for his hat. Now that Miss Sinclair is safely delivered. Nonsense, Tom insisted. It's still pouring out there, and the creek will be impassable until morning at least. There's room enough in the barn if you don't mind sharing with my old cow. Daniel hesitated, glancing at Grace. For some reason, he felt reluctant to leave her, though his rational mind told him she was safe now and no longer his concern. Stay, she said softly. The crossing will be dangerous even in daylight after this rain. Something in her green eyes made the decision for him. All right, he agreed. Thank you. Tom nodded and went to check on his wife and new daughter, leaving Daniel and Grace alone by the fire. I never properly thanked you, Grace said, looking up at him. For pulling me from the river, you saved my life. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. Anyone would have done the same. We both know that's not true, she replied with a small smile. In any case, I'm grateful. A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the steady rhythm of the rain on the roof. Daniel found himself studying Grace's profile, the delicate curve of her jaw, the small freckles scattered across her nose, the way her hair, now nearly dry, curled softly around her face. Where are you headed? She asked suddenly, turning to meet his gaze. Helena, he replied. I've got a job waiting at a cattle outfit north of there. You're a cowhand then, he nodded. For now. Grace seemed to understand there was more to the story, but she didn't press. Instead, she said, I should thank you properly when we get back to town, a meal at least. That's not necessary. I insist, she said with a firmness that suggested this was an argument he wouldn't win. Besides, the crossing might remain dangerous for several days. You'll need somewhere to stay if your business in Helena isn't urgent. Before Daniel could respond, Tom returned with blankets and a pillow. The barn's dry enough, he told Daniel, and there's fresh hay for bedding. Daniel nodded his thanks, suddenly aware of how tired he was. It had been a long day even before he'd heard Grace's cries for help. I'll check on Eliza and the baby at first light, Grace told Tom, stifling a yawn behind her hand. Get some rest, Miss Sinclair, Tom urged. You've earned it. As Daniel made his way to the door, Grace called after him softly, Good night, Mr. Blackburn. He turned back, tipping his hat slightly. Good night, Miss Sinclair. Sleep well. The barn was indeed dry, and the hay made a comfortable enough bed. As Daniel lay listening to the rain and the occasional lowing of the cow, he found himself thinking about Grace Sinclair, her courage, her dedication to her patient, the way her eyes had lit up when she'd presented that tiny new life to Tom Patterson. It had been a long time since Daniel had allowed himself to take notice of a woman that way. Not since before the war, when he'd been little more than a boy with simple dreams of someday having a farm and family of his own. The war had changed all that, leaving scars both visible and hidden. Since then, he'd drifted from job to job, never staying in one place long enough to put down roots. He told himself it didn't matter. By tomorrow or the next day, the creek would recede enough for safe crossing, and he'd continue on to Helena as planned. He'd likely never see Grace Sinclair again. The thought left him with an unexpected hollowness in his chest. Outside, the rain finally began to slacken, and Daniel closed his eyes, allowing sleep to claim him at last. Morning arrived with watery sunshine filtering through the cracks in the barn walls. Daniel rose, stretching his stiff muscles, and made his way outside. The storm had passed, leaving behind a washed, clean world sparkling with raindrops. The creek, however, still ran high and fast, muddy water churning between its banks. He found Tom outside, splitting wood with methodical strokes of an axe. "How's your wife and the baby?" Daniel asked, picking up a few of the split logs to stack them. "Doing well, thanks to Miss Sinclair," Tom replied, wiping sweat from his brow. "She was up half the night, checking on them both." Daniel nodded, not surprised by Grace's dedication. "The creek looks like it'll need another day or two to go down." "At least," Tom agreed. "You're welcome to stay as long as needed. It's the least I can do after you helped bring Miss Sinclair to us." Daniel thanked him, though he was already considering his options. He wasn't due in Helena for another week, but he'd never been one to impose on others' hospitality longer than necessary. The cabin door opened, and Grace emerged, looking remarkably refreshed despite her ordeal and lack of sleep. She'd pinned her hair up neatly, and someone, Eliza, presumably had mended the tear in her sleeve. "Good morning," she called, making her way toward them. "The baby nursed well, and Eliza's fever has broken." "Thank God," Tom said fervently, "and thank you, Miss Sinclair." She waved away his thanks. "I'm just glad I made it in time." She turned to Daniel. "How did you sleep, Mr. Blackburn?" "Well enough," he replied, struck again by her quiet beauty in the morning light. "The creek's still running high," she observed, glancing toward the swollen waterway. "I was just telling Mr. Blackburn he's welcome to stay until it's safe to cross," Tom said. Grace nodded. "As am I, it seems, though I worry about my horse." If she made it across, she likely headed back to town, Daniel assured her. "Horses have good instincts that way." "I hope you're right," she said, concern evident in her voice. "Willow was a gift from my father when I left Boston. She's been my faithful companion these 3 years." Daniel understood her attachment. His own buckskin Scout had been with him since just after the war. "We'll find her," he promised. "Once the water goes down, we can follow the creek back toward town looking for signs." Grace gave him a grateful smile that did something peculiar to his insides. "Thank you." The day passed quickly. Daniel helped Tom with chores around the homestead, repairing a section of fence damaged by the storm and patching a leak in the barn roof. Grace remained indoors, tending to Eliza and the baby and helping the older Patterson children with their lessons. By late afternoon, the creek had receded somewhat but was still flowing too fast for safe crossing. As dusk approached, Daniel found Grace sitting on the porch steps, gazing toward the distant mountains now bathed in golden light. "May I join you?" he asked. She nodded, moving slightly to make room for him on the step. They sat in companionable silence for several minutes. "You're very good at what you do," Daniel finally said. Grace looked at him questioningly. "I mean with Eliza and the baby," he clarified. "You knew exactly what to do, even after everything you'd been through," she smiled softly. "I've had excellent training. My father is a physician in Boston. I assisted him from the time I was 16, so you followed in his footsteps." "In a manner of speaking," she replied. "Though he never quite approved of my coming west. He wanted me to marry a doctor or lawyer and stay in Boston, hosting dinner parties and raising children." "But that wasn't the life you wanted." Grace's expression grew distant. "I thought it was once. I was engaged to a young doctor who worked with my father. James and I planned to open a practice together after our marriage." Her voice faltered slightly. "He died of typhoid fever 6 months before our wedding day." "I'm sorry," Daniel said, meaning it. She nodded, composing herself. "Afterward, I couldn't bear to stay in Boston. Everything reminded me of James, of the life we'd planned. When I heard that the Montana Territory was desperate for medical professionals, it seemed like fate." "Was it difficult starting over in a new place?" Grace laughed softly. "Terribly. The journey itself was arduous, and when I arrived in Silver Creek, several prominent citizens made it clear they didn't approve of a female doctor, though they're quick enough to call for me when their wives are in labor." Daniel could well imagine the resistance she'd faced. The West was still a man's world in many ways, despite the crucial roles women played in settling the frontier. "And now," he asked, "do you ever regret your decision to come here?" Grace considered the question seriously. "No," she said finally. "The work is hard, and the conditions are often primitive compared to Boston, but there's a freedom here I never had back east. And the people who do accept me, like the Pattersons, have become like family." Daniel nodded, understanding perfectly. It was one of the things he both loved and found unsettling about the West, the way communities formed out of necessity, creating bonds as strong as blood. "What about you?" Grace asked. "You mentioned you were in the war. What have you done since?" Daniel hesitated. His life since the war wasn't something he discussed often, mostly because there wasn't much worth telling. "This and that," he said vaguely. "Worked as a scout for the Army for a while, then tried my hand at mining in Colorado, did some cattle driving in Texas, nothing that stuck." "You've seen a lot of the country then." More than most, he acknowledged, and nowhere felt like home. Her question was gentle, without judgment. Daniel gazed toward the darkening horizon. Not yet. They fell silent again, but it was a comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts as the first stars appeared in the twilight sky. "We should head inside," Grace said eventually. "I need to check on Eliza one more time before bed." Daniel nodded, standing and offering her his hand. She took it, allowing him to help her up, and for a brief moment they stood close enough that he could smell the faint lavender scent of her hair. Then she stepped away, smoothing her skirts with a slightly flustered gesture. "Thank you for the company, Mr. Blackburn," she said formally. "Daniel," he corrected her. "I think pulling someone from a river puts us on a first-name basis, don't you?" A smile curved her lips. "Daniel then, and you must call me Grace." "Grace," he repeated, liking the way her name felt on his tongue. "Good night." "Good night, Daniel," she replied, before disappearing into the cabin, leaving him with the strange feeling that something significant had shifted between them. The next morning dawned clear and considerably warmer than the day before. Daniel was up at first light, checking the creek crossing. The water had receded enough that it might be passable, though still tricky. He returned to the cabin to find Grace already awake, drinking coffee with Tom at the rough-hewn table. "The creek's going down," Daniel reported. "We might be able to cross today, though it would be safer to wait until tomorrow." Grace nodded. "I'd like to stay another day anyway. Eliza's recovery is progressing well, but I want to make sure she and the baby are truly stable before I leave." "You're both welcome as long as needed," Tom assured them. "Though I expect you'll be eager to get back to town and check on your horse, Miss Sinclair." "Yes," Grace agreed, worry creasing her brow. "I can only hope Willow made it safely back to the livery." "I'll ride up the creek today," Daniel offered. "See if I can spot any sign of her." Grace's eyes widened. "You don't have to do that." "I'd like to," he insisted. "It'll give me something useful to do, and Scout could use the exercise." She studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Thank you." After breakfast, Daniel saddled Scout and set out to follow the creek upstream towards Silver Creek, keeping a sharp eye out for any sign of Grace's mare. The damage from the flooding was evident everywhere he looked: uprooted trees, debris caught in branches, muddy high-water marks on the banks. He'd ridden about 3 miles when he spotted hoofprints in a muddy section of the bank. They were partially washed away, but clear enough to show that a horse had scrambled out of the water at that point. Daniel dismounted to examine them more closely. The size was right for a mare like Grace had described, and the direction of the prints suggested the horse had headed toward town. Encouraged, Daniel continued his search, finding more tracks further along that confirmed the mare had indeed survived the river and was making her way back towards Silver Creek. He followed the trail until he was within sight of the town itself, a collection of wooden buildings strung along a dusty main street. The Silver Creek livery was easy to spot, a large barn-like structure at the edge of town. As Daniel approached, he saw a familiar-looking chestnut mare in the corral beside it. Relief washed through him. Grace would be overjoyed to know her beloved horse had made it safely back. He dismounted and tied Scout to the hitching post, then approached the older man who was forking hay into the corral. "Afternoon," Daniel called. "That chestnut mare, she belonged to Miss Sinclair, the midwife." The man straightened, eyeing Daniel suspiciously. "Who's asking?" "Name's Daniel Blackburn. Miss Sinclair and her horse got swept away crossing the creek during the storm night before last. I was able to help Miss Sinclair, but the horse bolted. Just wanted to make sure it made it back safely." The man's demeanor softened immediately. "Grace is all right then." "We've been worried sick. Willow came back without her yesterday morning, looking half-drowned herself." "She's fine," Daniel assured him. "She's staying with the Patterson family out by Eagle Creek until Eliza and her new baby are strong enough." "Thank the Lord," the man said, genuine relief in his voice. "I'm Hank Willis, by the way, run the livery. Grace boards Willow here." He extended a weathered hand, which Daniel shook. "You say you pulled her from the creek?" Daniel nodded. "Found her being swept downstream." "Managed to get her to shore." Hank whistled low. "Lucky thing you were there. That creek's taken more than one life over the years when it floods." He studied Daniel more carefully. You passing through, on my way to Helena, Daniel confirmed, got held up by the flooding. Well, Grace has rooms above her office in town. I expect she'd offer you one, given the circumstances. Daniel shifted uncomfortably at the implication in Hank's tone. I wouldn't want to impose, Hank chuckled. Son, you saved the woman's life. I reckon she'd be happy to have you stay. Besides, her place is right next door to the Silver Dollar, best food in the territory. Daniel considered this. He had planned to continue to Helena as soon as the creek was passable, but there was no real urgency. The job wouldn't start for another week, and the foreman had indicated there was some flexibility in his start date. I'll think on it, he told Hank. Meanwhile, would you mind if I left a message for Miss Sinclair, letting her know her horse is safe? Be glad to pass it along, Hank agreed. You heading back to the Patterson place now? Daniel nodded. Miss Sinclair will be relieved to hear about Willow. I bet, Hank said, his expression thoughtful. Grace thinks the world of that horse, almost as much as this town thinks of her. As Daniel rode back toward the Patterson homestead, he found himself thinking about the obvious respect in Hank's voice when he spoke of Grace. It seemed she had made quite an impression on the people of Silver Creek, despite the initial resistance she'd mentioned. He arrived back at the cabin in late afternoon to find Grace sitting on the porch with the new baby in her arms while the Patterson children played a game of tag in the yard. She looked up as he approached, a question in her eyes. Daniel smiled. She made it. Willow's safe at the livery in Silver Creek. The relief on Grace's face was immediate and profound. Oh, thank goodness. Is she injured? Not that I could see, Daniel assured her, dismounting. Hank Willis said she looked half-drowned when she showed up yesterday morning, but otherwise fine. You rode all the way to town? Grace asked, clearly surprised. Daniel shrugged. It's not far, and I followed her tracks along the creek. Grace's eyes softened. That was incredibly kind of you, Daniel. The way she said his name sent an unexpected warmth through his chest. It was nothing, he said, feeling unaccountably shy under her grateful gaze. She looked down at the infant in her arms, who was beginning to fuss. I should take her back to Eliza. It's nearly feeding time. She stood carefully, cradling the baby against her shoulder. Would you like to come in? Mrs. Patterson made a venison stew that's been simmering all day. The invitation was casual, but something in Grace's expression made Daniel think she genuinely wanted his company. I'd like that, he replied. Let me tend to Scout first. By the time Daniel had unsaddled and rubbed down his horse, dusk was falling. The cabin glowed with welcoming light as he approached, and the rich aroma of venison stew made his stomach growl appreciatively. Inside, the Patterson family and Grace were already seated around the table. An empty chair waited for him, next to Grace. As he took his place, Tom said a brief blessing over the food, and then bowls were passed around, filled with fragrant stew and accompanied by thick slices of fresh bread. The meal was lively, with the Patterson children peppering Daniel with questions about his travels and adventures. He found himself telling stories he hadn't thought about in years about the time he'd encountered a grizzly in Colorado, about the cattle stampede he'd helped stop in Texas, about the ancient cliff dwellings he'd discovered while scouting for the Army in Arizona Territory. Through it all, he was aware of Grace watching him, her eyes bright with interest. Occasionally their gazes would meet, and something unspoken would pass between them before one or the other looked away. After dinner, while Eliza nursed the baby and the children prepared for bed, Tom brought out a bottle of whiskey and poured small measures for himself, Daniel, and, to Daniel's surprise, Grace. Medicinal purposes, she said with a wink as she accepted the glass. Tom raised his glass in a toast. To new life, good friends, and safe journeys. They clinked glasses and sipped the fiery liquid, which burned pleasantly down Daniel's throat. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt a sense of belonging, of being part of something resembling a family circle. The feeling was both comforting and unsettling. Comforting because it reminded him of what he'd once dreamed of having himself. Unsettling because he knew it was temporary, a brief respite in his nomadic existence. Later, as they prepared to turn in for the night, Grace followed Daniel onto the porch. The sky was clear, a canopy of stars stretching from horizon to horizon. "I wanted to thank you again," she said quietly, "for checking on Willow. It means more than I can say." Daniel nodded. "I'm glad I could ease your mind. The creek should be crossable tomorrow," Grace observed, gazing toward where the water still flowed, glinting in the moonlight. "Will you continue on to Helena right away?" There was something in her tone, a carefully controlled neutrality that made Daniel wonder if she cared what his answer might be. "I suppose I should," he said slowly. "Though Hank at the livery mentioned you have rooms above your office in town. I wouldn't mind a proper bed for a night or two before the final leg of my journey." Grace turned to him, her expression unreadable in the darkness. "You'd be welcome to stay," she said. "It's the least I can do after everything you've done for me. I wouldn't want to impose." "It's not an imposition," she assured him. "The second room is just sitting empty. I've occasionally offered it to patients who need overnight observation, but it's free at the moment." Daniel hesitated, torn between the urge to continue on his way as planned and the unexpected desire to spend more time in Grace's company. "Think about it," she said, saving him from having to respond immediately. "You don't have to decide tonight." He nodded, grateful for the reprieve. "Thank you, Grace," she smiled, the moonlight catching the curve of her cheek. "Good night, Daniel, good night," he replied, watching as she slipped back into the cabin, leaving him alone with his thoughts and the vast, star-filled sky. Morning brought clear skies and the definitive news that the creek had receded enough for safe crossing. Daniel and Grace prepared to depart after breakfast, with profuse thanks from the Patterson family. "I'll be back to check on you and the baby in 3 days," Grace promised Eliza, who was up and about, though still moving carefully. "We can never thank you enough," Eliza said, embracing Grace warmly. "Both of you," she added, including Daniel with a grateful look. Tom shook Daniel's hand firmly. "You're welcome here anytime, Mr. Blackburn. Anyone who saves our Miss Sinclair is family as far as we're concerned." Daniel nodded, unexpectedly touched by the sentiment. "Thank you for your hospitality." The creek crossing proved uneventful, with both Daniel and Grace navigating their mounts through the still swift but manageable current without incident. Once on the other side, they fell into an easy pace side by side, the trail to Silver Creek wide enough for 2 horses. "Have you decided?" Grace asked after they'd ridden in companionable silence for a while. "About staying in town, I mean." Daniel had indeed spent much of the night considering his options. Logic told him to continue on to Helena as planned. But something else, something he wasn't quite ready to name, urged him to linger in Silver Creek. "I think I will stay a day or two," he said finally. "If your offer still stands." Grace smiled, the sunlight catching the golden highlights in her brown hair. "It does." They reached Silver Creek by midday. The town was larger than Daniel had realized during his brief visit the day before. Perhaps 30 buildings stretched along the main street, with smaller dwellings scattered on the outskirts. Besides the livery, he noted a general store, a blacksmith, what appeared to be a bank, and the Silver Dollar Saloon that Hank had mentioned. Grace led him to a neat 2-story building with a sign reading G. Sinclair, midwife and medical services hanging above the door. A small garden of medicinal herbs grew alongside the building, and a hitching rail out front already hosted a patient's horse. "It seems you have a visitor waiting," Daniel observed as they dismounted. Grace nodded, recognition in her eyes as she took in the dappled gray horse. "Mrs. Hollister. She's expecting her first child in about a month, probably here for a routine check." She tied Willow to the rail and turned to Daniel. "Would you mind taking Scout to the livery? Hank will take good care of him. I'll get my patient settled, and then I can show you to the room upstairs." "Of course," Daniel agreed, touched by her consideration for her patient's privacy. By the time he returned from the livery, where Hank had greeted him with friendly curiosity about his plans, Grace was bidding farewell to a young woman with an already prominent baby bump. The woman eyed Daniel with undisguised interest as she passed him on her way out. "Everything all right with your patient?" Daniel asked as he joined Grace on the small porch. She nodded. just a routine visit. Though in this town, I expect by supper time everyone will be speculating about the mysterious stranger staying at the midwife's place." Her eyes twinkled with amusement. "Will that cause problems for you?" Daniel asked. Suddenly concerned, Grace waved away his worry. "People will talk regardless of what I do. Besides, I've never much cared for gossip." She gestured toward the door. "Come in and I'll show you around." The ground floor of the building consisted of a tidy waiting room at the front and what was clearly Grace's examination room behind it, with a small kitchen and sitting area in the rear. A narrow staircase led to the second floor where Grace showed him to a pleasant room overlooking the main street. "It's not fancy," she said apologetically, "but the bed is comfortable and you have your own washstand." "It's perfect," Daniel assured her, setting down his saddlebags. The room was simple but clean, with a brass bed, a small dresser, and a rocking chair by the window. It was more comfortable than anywhere he'd stayed in months. "My room is across the hall," Grace continued, "and there's a small bathing room at the end of the corridor. Hot water requires heating on the stove downstairs, I'm afraid." "I've been washing in creeks for weeks," Daniel reminded her with a smile. "Hot water of any sort sounds like luxury," Grace laughed. "Well then, I'll leave you to get settled. I have a few patients to see this afternoon, but I usually take supper at the Silver Dollar around 6. You're welcome to join me." "I'd like that," Daniel said, meaning it. After Grace left, Daniel unpacked his meager belongings and took advantage of the washbasin to clean up. His reflection in the small mirror above it gave him pause. His dark hair was too long, his beard more than stubble now. He should probably clean up properly before joining Grace for supper. Downstairs, he could hear the murmur of voices as Grace saw another patient. He slipped out quietly, heading back to the livery where he'd noticed a barber pole. An hour later, freshly shaved and with his hair trimmed neatly, Daniel strolled through Silver Creek, taking in the sights. The town had a prosperous feel to it, not as rough and tumble as some mining communities he'd passed through, but not as genteel as the larger cities back east either. It was a place in between, where the frontier and civilization met. At the general store, he purchased a new shirt, his old one being somewhat worse for wear after the adventure in the creek. The proprietor, a garrulous older man named Jenkins, was eager to talk. "You're the fella who saved Miss Sinclair from the creek, ain't you?" he asked as he wrapped Daniel's purchase in brown paper. News traveled fast in small towns. "I was fortunate to be in the right place at the right time," Daniel replied diplomatically. Jenkins nodded approvingly. "Good thing, too. This town would be lost without that young lady. She's brought more babies into this world than I can count and saved just as many lives with her doctoring." "She's clearly well respected," Daniel observed. "Wasn't always that way," Jenkins confided, leaning across the counter. "When she first arrived, some folks thought it wasn't proper, a woman doing a man's job, but she won them over, one patient at a time. Now even old Dr. Frederick sends people to her when he's too busy or when it's women's troubles." Daniel nodded, finding himself unsurprised by Grace's ability to overcome resistance through sheer competence and dedication. "You staying long in Silver Creek?" Jenkins asked, handing over the wrapped package. "Just a couple of days," Daniel replied. "I've got work waiting in Helena." "Shame," Jenkins said with a knowing look. "Miss Sinclair could use someone looking out for her. Works too hard, that one." Daniel wasn't quite sure how to respond to the implication, so he simply thanked Jenkins for the shirt and made his exit. As he walked back toward Grace's building, he pondered the storekeeper's words. Did Grace need someone looking out for her? She seemed remarkably self-sufficient, and yet there was something appealing about the idea of being that person, the one she could lean on when her own strength faltered. He shook his head at the direction of his thoughts. He barely knew Grace Sinclair, and he'd be moving on in a day or two. Such fanciful notions had no place in his practical existence. At 6 o'clock precisely, Daniel found himself waiting on the porch of Grace's office. She emerged a few minutes later, having changed from her practical work dress into a simpler but more flattering blue gown that brought out the color of her eyes. "You look nice," he said, the words escaping before he could consider them. A faint blush colored her cheeks. Thank you. You look quite different yourself. She gestured to his clean-shaven face and new shirt. Daniel ran a self-conscious hand along his jaw. Thought I should make myself presentable for dinner. It suits you, she said with a small smile. Shall we? I'm famished. The Silver Dollar was busy but not crowded when they arrived. The establishment was clearly more restaurant than saloon, with families and couples occupying many of the tables. A heavy-set woman with graying hair pinned in a neat bun approached as they entered. Grace Sinclair. We were starting to worry when you didn't come in for supper last night. Hank told us what happened at the creek. She enveloped Grace in a warm hug before turning her attention to Daniel, eyeing him appraisingly. And this must be your rescuer. Daniel Blackburn, Grace confirmed. Daniel, this is Mabel Johnson, owner of the Silver Dollar and maker of the best apple pie west of the Mississippi. Flatterer, Mabel said with a pleased smile. Come on, I've saved your usual table. She led them to a quiet corner by the window where they could observe the activity in the restaurant while maintaining some privacy. I'll bring you both the special roast beef with potatoes and greens, Mabel announced. And don't argue, Grace. You look like you could use a good meal after your ordeal, Grace laughed. I wouldn't dream of arguing with you, Mabel. As Mabel bustled away, Daniel raised an eyebrow. You really do know everyone in town, don't you? Hard not to in a place this size, Grace replied. And I've delivered 2 of Mabel's grandchildren, which creates a certain bond. Their conversation flowed easily over dinner, which was indeed excellent. Daniel found himself sharing more about his past than he had in years, his childhood on a small farm in Pennsylvania, his service during the war, his restless wanderings since. In turn, Grace told him about her upbringing in Boston as the only child of a prominent physician, her years assisting in her father's practice, and her gradual realization that she wanted to do more than simply serve tea to her father's colleagues. It wasn't that I disliked Boston society, she explained as they lingered over coffee and the promised apple pie, which lived up to its reputation. But I wanted my life to have purpose beyond hosting dinner parties and charitable committees. Your father must have been proud when you decided to follow in his footsteps, Daniel observed. Grace's expression grew wistful. In some ways, yes, he taught me everything he knew about medicine. But he never quite understood why I couldn't be satisfied with the life he envisioned for me: marriage to a suitable gentleman, children, a comfortable home in the right neighborhood. And after your fiancé died, Daniel asked gently. Father thought my decision to come west was grief-driven madness, Grace admitted. Perhaps it was initially, but it's become so much more than that. Here, I'm needed in a way I never would have been in Boston. Every day, I make a real difference in people's lives. The passion in her voice was unmistakable, and Daniel found himself envying her certainty about her place in the world. His own life had lacked such clear purpose since the war. What about you? Grace asked, bringing him back to the present. What are you looking for in Helena? Daniel considered the question. Honestly, just another job, another place to be for a while, and then, he shrugged. Then I'll move on to somewhere else, I suppose. That's been the pattern. Grace studied him thoughtfully. Do you ever think about settling somewhere? Finding a place that feels like home, the question hit closer to his core than he was comfortable with. Sometimes, he admitted, but it's been a long time since anywhere felt like it could be that place. Grace's eyes held his, and for a moment, Daniel felt as though she could see right through him past the carefully constructed barriers to the lonely soul beneath. It was both terrifying and strangely liberating. The moment was broken by Mabel's return to their table. More coffee. She offered, eyeing them with barely concealed interest. No, thank you, Mabel, Grace replied. I should be getting back. I have an early patient tomorrow. As they walked back to Grace's building in the gathering dusk, a comfortable silence fell between them. The streets of Silver Creek were quiet now, with only the occasional patron entering or leaving the saloon further down the street. At Grace's door, they paused. Thank you for dinner, Daniel said, and for the room. It's the least I could do, she replied softly. Will you? Will you be leaving tomorrow? There was something in her voice, a slight hesitation that made Daniel's heart beat faster. I'm not sure, he found himself saying. I'm not expected in Helena for another few days. Grace nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Well, you're welcome to stay as long as you'd like. Their eyes met, and Daniel felt a powerful urge to reach out and touch her face to see if her skin was as soft as it looked in the fading light. But the moment passed, and Grace turned to unlock her door. Good night, Daniel, she said, glancing back over her shoulder. Good night, Grace, he replied, watching as she disappeared inside. As Daniel climbed the stairs to his room a few minutes later, he found himself reconsidering his plans. Would it really be so terrible to stay in Silver Creek a little longer? The job in Helena would keep, or there would be others. And there was something about Grace Sinclair that made him reluctant to ride away just yet. The next morning, Daniel woke to the sounds of the town coming to life, horses clopping down the main street, the blacksmith's hammer ringing in the distance, voices calling greetings to one another. It was a pleasant change from the isolation he'd grown accustomed to on the trail. Downstairs, he found Grace in the kitchen, already dressed for the day and preparing breakfast. She looked up with a smile as he entered. Good morning, she greeted him. Did you sleep well? Better than I have in months, Daniel admitted, taking a seat at the small table. Something about a real bed after weeks of bedrolls on the ground, Grace laughed, setting a plate of eggs and bacon before him. I can imagine. Coffee, please, he said, inhaling the rich aroma appreciatively as she poured him a cup. Do you have a busy day ahead? She nodded, joining him at the table with her own breakfast. 3 prenatal visits this morning, and Mrs. Fletcher's baby is due any day now. I'll need to check on her this afternoon. Daniel was struck by how much responsibility she carried. Do you ever get overwhelmed by it all? Being the only medical person for miles around, Grace considered the question seriously. Sometimes, she admitted, especially when there are multiple emergencies at once or when I lose a patient despite everything I try. A shadow passed over her face. That's the hardest part, knowing that no matter how much knowledge or skill you have, sometimes it's not enough. Daniel nodded, understanding all too well. He'd held too many dying men during the war, powerless to save them despite desperate efforts. But the good days outweigh the bad, Grace continued, her expression brightening. When a difficult birth ends with a healthy mother and baby, or when a child recovers from a dangerous fever, those moments make everything worthwhile. Her dedication was remarkable, and Daniel found himself wondering how different his own life might have been if he'd found such a clear calling. What are your plans for today? Grace asked, changing the subject. Daniel hesitated. I thought I might ride out a bit, explore the area. If I'm going to stay another day or two, I'd like to get a feel for the place. Something flickered in Grace's eyes, pleasure, perhaps, at his decision to remain longer. It's beautiful country, she said. If you ride north along the creek for about 5 miles, there's a waterfall that's worth seeing. Maybe I'll do that, Daniel replied. Unless you need help with anything here, Grace shook her head. I'll be busy with patients most of the day. But perhaps this evening, if you're not too tired from your explorations, we could take a walk. There's a nice view of the sunset from the hill behind the church. The invitation sent an unexpected warmth through Daniel's chest. I'd like that, he said simply. After breakfast, Daniel saddled Scout and rode out of town, following Grace's directions north along the creek. The day was perfect for riding, clear skies, a gentle breeze, and the landscape awash in late spring colors. Wildflowers carpeted the meadows, and the distant mountains stood sharp against the blue sky. As he rode, Daniel found his thoughts returning again and again to Grace. There was something about her that drew him, not just her beauty, though she was certainly beautiful, but her strength, her compassion, her clear sense of purpose. In just a few days, she'd made more of an impression on him than anyone he'd met in years. The waterfall, when he found it, was indeed worth seeing, a 30-foot cascade of crystal-clear water tumbling over moss-covered rocks into a deep pool below. Daniel dismounted, allowing Scout to graze while he sat on a sun-warmed boulder, lost in thought. What was he doing? He'd spent the years since the war deliberately avoiding attachments, moving on whenever he felt himself growing too comfortable in one place. It was safer that way for him, and for anyone who might make the mistake of caring about him. The war had left scars that weren't visible but ran deep nonetheless. Nightmares still plagued him occasionally, and the memories of what he'd seen and done haunted quiet moments. And yet, sitting there by the waterfall, Daniel found himself imagining a different life. One with roots and connections. One where he woke each morning with purpose, not just the need to earn enough for his next meal. One where someone like Grace might look at him each day with the warmth he'd glimpsed in her eyes the night before. It was a dangerous line of thinking. He barely knew Grace, and she barely knew him, the real him, not just the sanitized version of his past he'd shared over dinner. Besides, she had built a life here in Silver Creek, a life of meaning and respect. What could he possibly offer her that would compare to that? With a sigh, Daniel got to his feet. It was time to head back to town. He had promised Grace a walk to watch the sunset, and despite his misgivings, he found he was looking forward to it more than he cared to admit. When Daniel returned to Grace's office in the late afternoon, he found her just finishing with her last patient of the day, an elderly man with a persistent cough, whom she supplied with a bottle of some herbal remedy. "That should help, Mr. Daniels," she was saying as Daniel entered the waiting room. "Take a spoonful morning and night and come back in a week if it hasn't improved." The old man nodded gratefully, then eyed Daniel with undisguised curiosity. "This the fella who pulled you from the creek?" He asked Grace. She smiled. "Yes, Mr. Daniels, this is Daniel Blackburn." Mr. Daniels extended a gnarled hand which Daniel shook. "Good thing you were there, son. This town needs its angel of mercy." He patted Grace's hand affectionately before making his way out the door, moving slowly but steadily. "Angel of mercy?" Daniel asked with a raised eyebrow once they were alone. Grace blushed slightly. "Mr. Daniels tends toward the dramatic. Did you find the waterfall?" "I did," Daniel confirmed. "It's beautiful, just like you said." "One of my favorite places," Grace said, turning to tidy her examination room. "I go there sometimes when I need to clear my head after a difficult case." Daniel could understand why. The peaceful setting seemed made for contemplation and healing. "Are you still up for that walk?" Grace asked, glancing back at him. "I should change first. This dress has seen better days." She gestured to a small stain on her skirt, likely from one of her patient examinations. "Of course," Daniel assured her. "Take your time." While Grace went upstairs to change, Daniel waited in the small sitting area, leafing through a medical text that lay open on the side table. The diagrams and terminology were largely unintelligible to him, but he was impressed by the complexity of knowledge Grace had mastered. She returned a short while later, having changed into a simpler dress of soft green that complemented her eyes. She'd let her hair down from its practical bun, and it fell in loose waves around her shoulders. "Ready?" she asked, her cheeks slightly flushed under his appreciative gaze. Daniel nodded, setting aside the book. "Lead the way." They walked through town, exchanging greetings with people they passed. Daniel noticed how many stopped to talk with Grace, asking after sick relatives or thanking her for previous care. It was clear she was not just respected but genuinely loved by the community. The hill behind the church offered a sweeping view of the valley, with Silver Creek nestled in its center and the mountains rising majestically beyond. They reached the summit just as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, casting long shadows and painting the landscape in gold. "It's beautiful," Daniel said softly, taking in the panorama. "Yes," Grace agreed, her face tilted toward the setting sun. "This is why I stay despite the challenges. I can't imagine living anywhere else now." They stood in companionable silence for several minutes, watching the play of light across the valley. A gentle breeze carried the scent of pine and wildflowers, and somewhere in the distance, a lone wolf called to its pack. "Do you ever miss it?" Daniel asked eventually. "Boston, I mean." "The comforts of the city," Grace considered the question. "Sometimes," she admitted, "hot baths and libraries and concert halls, but I've found other comforts here, different ones but no less meaningful." She turned to look at him. "What about you? Do you miss Pennsylvania?" Daniel hesitated. "The farm? No, it was a hard life and there wasn't much left for me after my parents died." He looked out toward the mountains. "But I do sometimes miss having a place that feels like it's mine, somewhere I belong." Grace's eyes were gentle on his face. "What happened during the war, Daniel?" "You never really said." The question caught him off guard, though perhaps it shouldn't have. Grace was observant, and he'd been deliberately vague about those years. "I was a medic," he said slowly, "saw more death and suffering than any man should. Did things I'm not proud of, even though they were necessary." He took a deep breath. "And I killed men not just as a medic trying to save lives, but later, when I was transferred to a fighting unit." He waited for her to recoil, to look at him differently, but her expression remained open and compassionate. "War forces impossible choices," she said softly. "I've treated veterans, heard their stories, the guilt they carry, even when they did what they had to do." Daniel nodded, something tight in his chest easing slightly at her understanding. "After the war, I couldn't settle anywhere, kept feeling like I didn't deserve peace or happiness." He hadn't intended to reveal so much, but something about Grace made it easier to speak of things he usually kept buried. "And now," she asked, "do you still feel that way?" Daniel considered the question. "Less than I used to," he said honestly. "Time helps and distance." Grace nodded, her gaze returning to the sunset. "I think we all carry burdens from our past," she said quietly. "Things we wish we'd done differently, people we couldn't save." A shadow passed over her face. "My fiancé, James, I was the one who diagnosed his typhoid, but I couldn't cure him. For a long time, I blamed myself, wondered if another doctor might have saved him." "That wasn't your fault," Daniel said immediately. Grace gave him a sad smile. "Just as the men who died despite your care weren't yours. But knowing something intellectually isn't the same as feeling it in your heart." Daniel was struck by how perfectly she understood. They stood in silence for a moment, the shared understanding creating a connection that felt deeper than their brief acquaintance would suggest. "The sun's almost gone," Grace observed, nodding toward the horizon where only a sliver of gold remained. "We should head back," Daniel agreed reluctantly, not wanting their time together to end. As they walked down the hill toward town, Grace's hand brushed against his. Without thinking, Daniel captured it in his own, his rough fingers closing gently around her smaller ones. He half expected her to pull away, but instead she gave his hand a gentle squeeze. The simple contact sent a current of warmth up his arm and straight to his heart. They walked hand in hand back to Grace's office, neither speaking, both acutely aware of this new dimension to their relationship. At her door, they paused. The main street was quiet now, most businesses closed for the evening, only the distant sounds of the saloon breaking the silence. "Thank you for the walk," Grace said softly, "and for sharing what you did. I know it wasn't easy." Daniel nodded, still holding her hand. "Thank you for listening, for not judging." Their eyes met in the gathering darkness, and Daniel felt drawn toward her as if by some invisible force. Slowly, giving her every chance to step away, he leaned down. Her lips met his halfway, soft and warm and tentative at first, then with growing confidence. The kiss was brief but profound, leaving Daniel breathless when they finally parted. Grace's eyes were wide, a mixture of wonder and uncertainty in their depths. "I should go in," she whispered, though she made no move to do so. "Yes," Daniel agreed, equally reluctant to end the moment. Finally, Grace stepped back, her hand slipping from his. "Good night, Daniel." "Good night, Grace," he replied, watching as she disappeared inside, the door closing softly behind her. Daniel stood there for a long moment, his heart racing, his mind a whirl of conflicting emotions. The kiss had been unexpected, yet somehow inevitable, a culmination of the connection that had been building between them since he'd pulled her from the creek. But what now? He was still planning to leave for Helena, wasn't he? And Grace belonged here in Silver Creek, where she was needed and respected. The practical part of his mind insisted that nothing had changed. This was just a moment of connection between two lonely souls. Yet as Daniel finally turned and walked toward the Silver Dollar for a solitary drink, he couldn't shake the feeling that everything had changed. For the first time in years, he found himself contemplating a future different from the rootless existence he'd resigned himself to. A future that included Grace Sinclair. It was a dangerous thought, and one he wasn't sure he had the right to entertain. But as he sipped his whiskey at the bar, watching the reflections of lamplight in the amber liquid, Daniel knew with certainty that riding away from Silver Creek and from Grace would be harder than he'd anticipated. The next morning, Daniel woke to the sound of urgent voices downstairs. He dressed quickly and made his way to the ground floor, where he found Grace hastily packing her medical bag while a frantic-looking young man hovered nearby. "I'll be right there, Ben," she was saying. "Go back and tell your father to keep her comfortable." "Make sure she stays lying down, understand?" The young man, who couldn't have been more than 17, nodded nervously. "Yes, madam, but please hurry. Ma's in awful pain." "What's happening?" Daniel asked as the boy rushed out the door. Grace looked up, relief crossing her face when she saw him. "Mrs. Fletcher's in labor, but something's wrong. The baby's coming early and Ben says there's bleeding." She closed her bag with decisive snap. "I need to get out there right away." "Where's their place?" Daniel asked, already reaching for his hat. "About 10 miles north, near Pine Ridge," Grace replied. "Why, I'm coming with you," he said simply. Grace hesitated. "You don't have to, I want to," Daniel interrupted. "You might need an extra pair of hands, and I've had some medical training, remember?" A mixture of emotions crossed Grace's face: gratitude, relief, and something else that made Daniel's heart beat faster. "Thank you," she said softly. "I could use the help." Within minutes, they were mounted and riding hard out of town, Grace on Willow and Daniel on Scout. The Fletcher homestead was isolated, tucked into a valley beyond the ridge that gave it its name. The morning was clear but cool, with a brisk wind that carried the scent of pine and sage. They rode mostly in silence, both focused on reaching their destination quickly. Occasionally, Grace would glance over at Daniel, a question in her eyes that neither of them had time to address. What about last night? What about the kiss they'd shared? But those questions would have to wait. They arrived at the Fletcher place just before noon, a modest cabin with a well-tended garden and a small barn. A man in his 40s paced anxiously on the porch, and 3 children of various ages huddled nearby, their faces scared. "Thank God you're here," the man said as Grace dismounted. "Sarah's in a bad way. The bleeding started about 2 hours ago and the pains are coming faster now." Grace nodded, her professional demeanor firmly in place. "This is Daniel Blackburn," she told Mr. Fletcher. "He's assisting me today." Fletcher barely spared Daniel a glance, his concern entirely focused on his wife. "Whatever you need, just ask." Inside, the situation was indeed dire. Sarah Fletcher lay on a bed in the corner of the main room, her face ashen, her nightgown soaked with sweat and blood. She moaned softly as Grace approached, her eyes glazed with pain. "Sarah, it's Grace," she said gently, taking the woman's hand. "I'm going to help you and your baby, all right, but first I need to examine you." The woman nodded weakly, then cried out as another contraction seized her. Grace moved with practiced efficiency, washing her hands in a basin of water that Daniel heated on the stove. She pulled a screen across to give Sarah privacy, then began her examination. Daniel busied himself preparing the items. Grace called for clean cloths, boiled water, her surgical instruments laid out in precise order. He'd assisted field surgeons during the war and recognized the gravity in Grace's expression when she emerged from behind the screen. "The baby's turned wrong," she told him quietly, out of Sarah's earshot. "And there's a partial placental abruption causing the bleeding. I need to turn the baby, but if the bleeding doesn't stop." She trailed off, but Daniel understood the implication. "What can I do?" he asked. "For now, keep the water boiling and the cloths coming," Grace replied, "and pray." The next few hours were a blur of intense activity. Grace worked tirelessly, her focus unwavering as she fought to save both mother and child. Daniel assisted as best he could, following her instructions precisely, offering encouragement to Sarah when Grace needed him to hold the woman's hand, and providing whatever support Grace required. Outside, the sun began its westward descent. casting long shadows through the cabin windows. Mr. Fletcher continued his anxious pacing, occasionally looking in on his wife before retreating to comfort their frightened children. "I've got it," Grace said suddenly, triumph in her voice. "The baby's turning. Sarah, when I tell you, I need you to push with everything you have, understand." The exhausted woman nodded weakly, gathering her remaining strength. Daniel moved to support her shoulders, helping her into a better position for delivery. "Now, Sarah, push," Grace commanded. With a cry that seemed to come from her very soul, Sarah pushed. Daniel could feel the tremendous effort it took, her entire body trembling with exertion. "Again," Grace urged. "The head's crowning." One more big push, Sarah bore down once more, and suddenly a new sound filled the cabin, the indignant wail of a newborn taking its first breath. "It's a boy," Grace announced, her voice thick with emotion. "A beautiful, healthy boy." Daniel watched as she quickly cleared the baby's airways, wrapped him in a clean blanket, and placed him briefly on Sarah's chest before turning her attention back to the mother, whose bleeding still needed to be addressed. "Mr. Fletcher," Grace called. "Come meet your son while I finish caring for your wife." The man entered cautiously, then broke into a tearful smile at the sight of his new child. Daniel stepped back, allowing the family this moment of joy while Grace continued her work with quiet efficiency. It was another hour before Grace finally declared that Sarah was stable, the bleeding controlled, and both mother and baby out of immediate danger. By then, night had fallen, and exhaustion was evident in every line of Grace's body. "You should rest here tonight," Mr. Fletcher insisted when Grace mentioned returning to town. "It's too dark for safe travel, and you both look dead on your feet." Grace hesitated, then nodded. "Thank you, we'll leave at first light to avoid imposing further." "Imposing?" Fletcher scoffed. "You saved my wife and son. You can stay a month if you need to." A makeshift bed was arranged for Grace in the children's room, while Daniel was given blankets to sleep near the hearth in the main room. After checking on Sarah and the baby one final time, Grace bid everyone good night and retreated to get some much-needed rest. Daniel lay awake for some time, staring at the ceiling beams illuminated by the dying firelight. Today had shown him yet another dimension of Grace, her unwavering courage and skill in the face of a medical crisis. The way she had fought for Sarah and her child, refusing to give up despite the odds, had moved him deeply. He had treated many wounds during the war, had saved lives when possible, but what Grace did was different. She brought new life into the world, even while battling to preserve another. It was a profound calling, one that required not just knowledge but heart. As sleep finally claimed him, Daniel's last conscious thought was of Grace's triumphant smile when the baby had taken his first breath, a moment of pure joy amidst the life and death struggle. It was a smile he wanted to see again and again. They rode back to Silver Creek the next morning, having left Sarah and her son resting comfortably under Mr. Fletcher's watchful eye. The journey was quiet, both of them tired from the previous day's events and lost in their own thoughts. "Thank you for your help yesterday," Grace said as the town came into view. "Having you there made a difference." Daniel shook his head. "You did all the real work, I just followed orders." "Still," she insisted, "it meant a lot to have someone to rely on. Usually I face those situations alone." The thought of Grace confronting such emergencies by herself troubled Daniel. She was clearly capable, but everyone needed support sometimes, especially when lives hung in the balance. "When are you leaving for Helena?" Grace asked suddenly, her voice carefully neutral. The question caught Daniel off guard, though he should have expected it. His original plan had been to stay only a day or two in Silver Creek, and he'd already been there 3. "I'm not sure," he admitted. "The job will wait a few more days if needed." Grace nodded, her eyes fixed on the trail ahead. "I've enjoyed having you here," she said softly, "more than I expected to." The simple admission warmed Daniel's heart. "I've enjoyed being here," he replied. "With you." They reached Grace's office without further conversation, both aware that they stood at a crossroads but uncertain how to proceed. The kiss they'd shared before Mrs. Fletcher's emergency remained unaddressed, hanging between them like an unfinished sentence. I should check if any patients have come by during my absence, Grace said as they dismounted. Would you mind taking the horses to the livery? Hank will look after them. Daniel nodded, gathering both sets of reins. Of course. At the livery, Hank greeted him with his usual friendliness. Heard you rode out with Grace to help the Fletcher woman, he commented as he took the horses. How'd it go? Mother and baby are doing well, Daniel reported, surprising himself with the pride he felt in Grace's accomplishment. Grace did an amazing job. She always does, Hank agreed, leading the horses to water. That young woman's got more courage and skill than most men I've known. He gave Daniel a sidelong look. You two seem to have taken a shine to each other. Daniel felt heat rise in his face. We've become friends, he said carefully. Hank chuckled. If you say so, but I've known Grace since she arrived in Silver Creek and I've never seen her look at anyone the way she looks at you. He paused, his expression growing serious. She deserves happiness, you know, after everything she's been through. I know, Daniel said quietly. But I'm not sure I'm the right person to provide it. My life isn't exactly settled. Maybe it's time it was, Hank suggested mildly. There's worse places to put down roots than Silver Creek. Daniel had no ready answer for that. He thanked Hank for his help with the horses and headed back toward Grace's office, his mind churning with conflicting thoughts and emotions. Could he really consider staying in Silver Creek? What would that even look like? He had no profession beyond the various jobs he'd worked since the war: cowhand, scout, occasional handyman. What could he offer a community like this? What could he offer Grace? And yet, the thought of riding away, of never seeing her again, left a hollow feeling in his chest that he couldn't ignore. Back at Grace's office, he found her examining a young boy with a splinted arm. She looked up briefly as he entered, a tired smile crossing her face before she returned her attention to her patient. The break is healing nicely, Joey, she was saying. Another week in the splint and then we can see about removing it. The boy nodded solemnly. Will I still be able to play baseball? Grace's smile widened. I don't see why not, but let's get you fully healed first, all right. After Joey left with his mother, Grace sank into a chair with a sigh. I had 3 patients waiting when I got back, she explained. Nothing serious, thankfully. Just follow-up visits. Daniel nodded, taking the seat opposite her. You should rest. Yesterday was exhausting. I will, she promised. Once I've had something to eat, I'm famished. I could go to the Silver Dollar, bring something back, Daniel offered. Grace considered this, then shook her head. Actually, I'd rather cook something simple here if you don't mind. It helps me unwind after a difficult case. Can I help? Daniel asked. Grace smiled, something softening in her expression. I'd like that. They moved to the small kitchen at the back of the building, where Grace set about preparing a simple meal of bacon, eggs, and bread. Daniel assisted as directed, slicing bread and setting the table while Grace cooked. There was a comfortable domesticity to the scene that stirred something long dormant in Daniel's heart. I want to talk about the other night, Grace said suddenly, her back to him as she tended the frying bacon. Before we were interrupted, Daniel's heart rate increased. The kiss, you mean? She nodded, turning to face him. I don't usually, that is, I haven't. She took a breath. It meant something to me, Daniel, and I need to know if it meant something to you too, or if it was just a moment. The vulnerability in her eyes nearly undid him. It meant something, he said honestly. More than I expected it to. Relief crossed her face, followed by uncertainty. But you're still leaving for Helena. It wasn't quite a question, but Daniel heard the real one beneath it. Will you still leave me? I don't know, he admitted. I haven't decided yet. Grace nodded, turning back to the stove. I understand, you have commitments, a job waiting. It's not just that, Daniel said, moving closer. Grace, look at me. She did, her green eyes meeting his with that direct gaze he'd come to admire. You have a life here, he continued, a purpose. People who need you. What could I possibly offer that would compare to that? Understanding dawned in her eyes. Is that what you think, that you have nothing to offer? What do I have? He asked, gesturing vaguely. No real profession beyond hired work, no home. Just a horse and whatever fits in my saddlebags. Grace set down the spatula and took a step toward him. You have courage, she said softly. I saw that when you pulled me from the creek. You have kindness the way you helped the Patterson family, how you came with me to the Fletchers without hesitation. You have skills from your time as a medic that could be valuable here." Daniel shook his head, though her words touched something deep inside him. "A few good qualities don't make a life." "No," Grace agreed, "but they're a foundation to build one on." She hesitated, then reached for his hand. "Here, perhaps, if you wanted to." The implication of her words, the invitation in them, left Daniel momentarily speechless. "Are you asking me to stay in Silver Creek?" he finally managed. "I'm suggesting you consider it," Grace replied carefully. "Not just for me, though I won't pretend I wouldn't be happy if you did, but for yourself, too. You said you sometimes miss having a place that feels like it's yours. Maybe Silver Creek could be that place." The possibility unfurled before Daniel like a map to a destination he hadn't known he was seeking. Silver Creek, a small town with good people. Work to be done, perhaps not glamorous but honest and needed. And Grace, brilliant, compassionate Grace, who somehow saw worth in him that he'd long since stopped seeing in himself. "I need time to think," he said honestly. "It's not a decision to make lightly." Grace nodded, releasing his hand. "Of course, I wouldn't expect otherwise." She turned back to the stove, where the bacon was beginning to crisp. "Now, let's eat before this gets cold." They ate their meal in companionable silence, both aware of the weight of the conversation they'd just had and the decisions that lay ahead. Afterward, Grace excused herself to rest, the events of the previous day having caught up with her at last. Left alone, Daniel stepped outside onto the small porch, watching as the afternoon sun bathed Silver Creek in golden light. The town was alive with activity, children playing in the street, merchants tending to customers, a wagon loaded with supplies rumbling past. It was an ordinary scene, yet somehow compelling in its very ordinariness. This was real life, not the nomadic existence he'd been living since the war, moving from place to place without putting down roots. What would it be like to be part of such a community again? To have neighbors who knew his name, to contribute to the building of something lasting, and Grace. What would it be like to wake each day knowing she was near? To share more evenings like the ones they'd already spent together, talking about everything and nothing, to feel again the warmth of her lips against his. The questions had no easy answers, and Daniel knew he needed to consider them carefully. This wasn't just about what he wanted in the moment, but about what kind of life he could build, and whether he was ready to stop running from the past and start building a future. With these thoughts circling in his mind, Daniel set off toward the silver dollar. He needed advice, and there was one person in town who seemed to understand both him and Grace better than anyone else. Hank Willis wasn't at the livery when Daniel checked, but a stable boy directed him to the Silver Dollar. "He takes his supper there most evenings around this time," the boy explained. Sure enough, Daniel found Hank at a corner table, a plate of stew and a mug of beer before him. The older man looked up in surprise as Daniel approached. "Well now, didn't expect to see you here," Hank said, gesturing to the empty chair across from him. "Thought you'd be keeping company with our good doctor." "She's resting," Daniel explained, taking the offered seat. "Yesterday was difficult," Hank nodded knowingly. "Always is when there's complications with a birth. Glad to hear mother and baby pulled through." He studied Daniel's face. "But that's not why you're here, is it? Something's troubling you." Daniel hesitated, then decided honesty was the best approach. "Grace suggested I might consider staying in Silver Creek. Permanently." Hank's eyebrows rose. "Did she now? That's interesting. Grace isn't usually one to put her heart on the line." "It wasn't exactly. I mean, she didn't." Daniel stumbled over his words, unsure how to explain the nuanced conversation they'd had. Hank chuckled. "No need to spell it out, son. I've got eyes. The question is, what do you think of the idea?" Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know. Part of me wants to stay. But another part is scared as hell," Hank supplied helpfully. "That's natural. Settling down's a big step, especially for a man who's been drifting as long as you have." "It's not just that," Daniel admitted. "It's whether I have anything worthwhile to offer here to Grace." Hank leaned back in his chair, regarding Daniel thoughtfully. "Let me tell you something about this town. When I first came here 15 years ago, it was barely more than a mining camp, rough men doing dangerous work, with little to show for it but calloused hands and broken dreams. But a few of us saw potential for something more. We built, we worked, we created a community. He gestured around the busy saloon. None of us came with much besides a willingness to work hard and a vision for what could be. Daniel nodded, understanding the point Hank was making. As for what you could offer Grace, Hank continued, have you asked her what she might want? From what I've seen, it isn't material things she's lacking. She deserves someone established, Daniel argued. Someone with more to offer than a troubled past and an uncertain future. Hank's expression turned serious. Son, we all have troubled pasts in one way or another. What matters is what we do with the future. He took a sip of his beer, and from what I've seen, Grace Sinclair isn't interested in established, she's interested in you. The words hit Daniel with unexpected force. Could it really be that simple? That Grace saw something in him worth caring about despite everything? Think on it, Hank advised. But don't think too long. Opportunities like this don't come around often in a man's life. Daniel thanked Hank for his counsel and made his way back to Grace's office, his mind still churning with conflicting thoughts. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the main street, and a few early stars were visible in the eastern sky. Grace was awake when he returned, sitting in the small parlor with a book open in her lap. She looked up as he entered, a soft smile curving her lips. Feel better after your rest? He asked, taking the seat opposite her. She nodded. Much, though I expect I'll sleep soundly tonight. She marked her place in the book and set it aside. Where did you go? To see Hank, Daniel admitted. I wanted his perspective on things. I see, Grace said, her expression carefully neutral. And did he provide helpful insights? Daniel smiled slightly. He suggested I not overthink matters. A laugh escaped her. Sound advice, generally speaking. Their eyes met, and Daniel felt that now familiar tug of connection between them. It would be so easy to cross the space between them, to take her in his arms and forget all the practical concerns that plagued him. But he owed her more than that. He owed her honesty. I need to tell you something, he said quietly, about the war. About why I've never stayed anywhere long since then. Grace's expression grew solemn, but she nodded encouragingly. I'm listening. Daniel took a deep breath. I told you I was a medic, which was true, at least initially. What I didn't say was that later I was recruited for a different role. Because of my tracking skills and knowledge of the terrain in certain areas, I was asked to lead small units behind enemy lines for specific missions. Understanding dawned in Grace's eyes. Dangerous missions. Yes, Daniel confirmed, and not always honorable ones. He looked down at his hands. I've killed men, Grace, not in open battle, but in operations that sometimes felt more like murder than war. The admission cost him, but he forced himself to continue. After the war, I couldn't face staying in one place, building relationships with people who might look at me differently if they knew what I'd done. Grace was silent for a long moment, absorbing his words. When she finally spoke, her voice was gentle but firm. War makes us all do things we would never choose under normal circumstances. That doesn't define who you are, Daniel, doesn't it? He asked, meeting her gaze. Those choices, those actions, they've shaped everything since. Only because you've allowed them to, Grace countered. You've been punishing yourself for years, moving from place to place, never allowing yourself to form attachments or build a life. Her eyes were compassionate but unflinching. Don't you think it's time to forgive yourself? The question struck at the core of Daniel's self-imposed exile. Forgiveness, was it really that simple? Could he just decide to stop carrying the weight of his past actions? I don't know if I can, he admitted. Grace leaned forward, taking his hands in hers. Then perhaps it's time to try, not for my sake, but for your own. Her touch was warm and steady. You deserve happiness, Daniel, just as much as anyone. Looking into her eyes, Daniel wanted desperately to believe her. The possibility of a different future, one with purpose and connection, and perhaps even joy, seemed suddenly within reach, if only he had the courage to grasp it. I need to ride to Helena, he said finally, to inform them I won't be taking the job after all. Grace's eyes widened. Does that mean? It means I'd like to stay in Silver Creek, Daniel clarified, at least for a while, to see if I can build something here with you if you're willing. The smile that bloomed across Grace's face was like sunrise after a long, dark night. I'm willing, she said softly. Very willing. Daniel squeezed her hands gently. I can't promise it will be easy. I still have demons to face, and I'm not entirely sure what I'll do here. But I want to try, Grace. For the first time in years, I want to try. That's all any of us can do, she replied. Try each day to be better than we were the day before. Her eyes held his, filled with a warmth that made his heart skip. And having someone to try alongside makes the journey easier. Daniel nodded, feeling as though a weight he'd carried for years was beginning to lift. Not gone entirely, that would take time, but lighter already for having been shared. When will you leave for Helena? Grace asked. Tomorrow, if that's all right, Daniel replied. The sooner I go, the sooner I can return, Grace nodded, understanding in her eyes. I'll be here when you get back. Those simple words held a promise that touched Daniel deeply. She would be here, waiting for him. Not because she needed rescuing or because circumstance had thrown them together, but because she chose to be. Without further words, Daniel leaned forward and kissed her. Unlike their first kiss, which had been tentative and questioning, this one was filled with certainty, a promise of his own, sealed with the gentle pressure of his lips against hers. When they finally parted, Grace's cheeks were flushed, and her eyes shone with an emotion that made Daniel's breath catch. I should go prepare for tomorrow's ride, he said reluctantly. Grace nodded, rising with him. I'll pack provisions for your journey. As they moved around the kitchen, gathering supplies and discussing the route to Helena, Daniel was struck by how natural it felt, this simple domesticity, this planning for a future that included both of them. It was a feeling he'd almost forgotten, this sense of belonging, and he found himself treasuring it even as he marveled at how quickly it had developed. The next morning dawned clear and cool, perfect for traveling. Daniel saddled Scout while Grace packed the last of the provisions into his saddlebags. It should take 3 days to reach Helena, he told her, and perhaps 3 to return depending on the weather. Grace nodded, her expression composed though he could see the concern in her eyes. Be careful. The mountains can be treacherous this time of year, even with good weather. I will, Daniel promised. He hesitated, then added, Is there anything you need from Helena while I'm there? Books or supplies? The question seemed to please her. There's a medical supply shop on Main Street. If you have time, I could use more iodine and catgut sutures. She handed him a small list she'd prepared. Daniel tucked it into his shirt pocket. Consider it done. Their parting was brief but heartfelt, a kiss and an embrace that carried all the words they weren't yet ready to speak aloud. As Daniel rode out of Silver Creek, he found himself already looking forward to his return, a novel feeling for a man who had spent years leaving places behind without a backward glance. The journey to Helena was uneventful, the trail well-marked and the weather cooperative. Daniel pushed harder than he might have otherwise, eager to complete his business and begin the return trip to Silver Creek to Grace. Helena was a bustling city compared to Silver Creek, with brick buildings lining the main thoroughfares and a constant stream of wagons, riders, and pedestrians filling the streets. Daniel made his way directly to the Paradise Valley Ranch office, where he explained to a surprised foreman that he wouldn't be able to take the position after all. Found something better, did you? The man asked, not unkindly. Daniel considered the question. I think I have, he replied honestly. With that business concluded, Daniel spent the remainder of the day purchasing the medical supplies Grace had requested, and a few items for himself, new clothes more suited to town life than trail riding, books to replace the few dog-eared volumes he'd read countless times during lonely evenings on the trail. He also visited a telegraph office, sending a message to an old Army comrade who had settled in Denver after the war. Thomas Clark had repeatedly offered Daniel a partnership in his freight business, an offer Daniel had always declined. Now he inquired whether the opportunity might still exist, not for himself, but as a possible venture for Silver Creek. The town's location, midway between several larger settlements, made it potentially ideal for a freight operation. It was just an idea, one of several that had occurred to Daniel as he considered what useful role he might play in his new community, but it felt promising enough to explore. After 2 days in Helena, the minimum time required to complete his business, Daniel began the journey back to Silver Creek. The return trip seemed to take twice as long as the outbound journey had, despite good weather and easy traveling. His mind was constantly running ahead of him, back to the small town that had unexpectedly begun to feel like home, back to Grace. On the evening of the 3rd day, Daniel crested the final ridge that overlooked Silver Creek Valley. The town lay below, bathed in the golden light of sunset, smoke rising from chimneys in thin, straight columns that spoke of the calm, windless evening. From this distance, it looked peaceful, welcoming a place where a man might find rest after years of wandering. He urged Scout forward, eager to complete the final leg of the journey. As he approached Grace's office, he saw a figure sitting on the porch, Grace, watching the trail as if expecting him. When she caught sight of him, she stood, shading her eyes against the setting sun. Daniel's heart quickened at the sight of her. He'd been away less than a week, yet it felt like much longer. He dismounted in front of her building, tying Scout to the hitching post before turning to face her. "You're back," Grace said simply, her eyes taking in every detail of his appearance as if reassuring herself that he was truly there and whole. "I'm back," Daniel confirmed, closing the distance between them in 3 long strides, "and glad to be so." Their embrace was both homecoming and promise, the circle of her arms around his waist, the press of her cheek against his chest, the steady beat of their hearts finding a common rhythm. When they finally stepped apart, Grace's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I was beginning to worry," she admitted. "You're a day later than you estimated." "I had some extra business to attend to in Helena," Daniel explained. "Supplies to gather, ideas to explore." Grace's eyebrows rose questioningly, but before she could ask for details, the door to her office opened and Mabel Johnson emerged, wiping her hands on an apron. "Thought I heard voices out here," she said with a knowing smile. "Welcome back, Mr. Blackburn. You're just in time for supper roast chicken with all the fixings." She looked him up and down approvingly. "And it seems you could use a good meal after your journey." Daniel glanced at Grace, who gave a small shrug. "Mabel insisted on preparing a welcome home meal," she explained. "She's been cooking all afternoon. And it will be ready in 20 minutes, Mabel added firmly, "just enough time for you to get cleaned up from the trail." With that, she disappeared back inside, leaving Daniel and Grace alone on the porch. "Welcome home," Grace said softly, taking his hand. The words sent a surge of emotion through Daniel. Home. It had been so long since he'd had one, he'd almost forgotten what it felt like. But standing there with Grace's hand in his, the warm light spilling from the windows of the building she'd made into both workspace and dwelling, he felt it that sense of belonging, of rightness that had eluded him for years. "It's good to be home," he replied, meaning every word. That evening was the first of many they would share in the years to come. Over Mabel's excellent chicken dinner, Daniel told Grace about his journey, his decision to officially decline the Helena job, and his budding idea for a freight business based in Silver Creek. "The town is perfectly positioned," he explained, excitement in his voice. "With a regular freight service, goods could move more efficiently between Helena, and the smaller settlements. It would bring business to Silver Creek and provide a stable income." Grace listened with growing enthusiasm. "That's a wonderful idea, Daniel. The town could certainly use such a service, and it would suit your skills perfectly. I've telegraphed a former Army comrade who runs a similar operation in Denver," Daniel continued. "He might be willing to invest or advise. It's just in the planning stages, but it feels right." "It does," Grace agreed, her eyes shining with pride that warmed Daniel to his core. In the weeks that followed, Daniel's vision began to take shape. Tom Clark responded positively to his telegraph, offering not only advice but a partnership that would provide the capital needed to establish the Silver Creek Freight Company. Daniel secured a small building at the edge of town for an office and warehouse, and within a month, The first freight wagon bearing the company's name rolled out of Silver Creek bound for Helena. Meanwhile, Daniel continued to assist Grace when needed, his medical training proving useful during particularly busy periods or difficult cases. The two of them fell into a rhythm of shared work and leisure, their relationship deepening as they discovered new facets of each other's characters. Daniel found comfortable lodging at the town's small hotel, though he spent most evenings at Grace's place, sharing meals and conversation. They were careful to maintain propriety. Silver Creek was still a small town with traditional values, but it was widely understood that they were courting. 3 months after Daniel's decision to stay in Silver Creek, he and Grace rode out to the waterfall where he had gone on his first full day in the area. It was a perfect late summer day, the air warm but not hot, the sky an endless blue overhead. They picnicked on a blanket spread beside the pool, enjoying bread, cheese, and fruit while the waterfall provided a soothing backdrop of sound. Daniel had been unusually quiet during the ride, his mind occupied with the question he planned to ask. "Penny for your thoughts," Grace said eventually, studying his face. "You've been somewhere else all morning." Daniel smiled, reaching for her hand. "Not somewhere else, right here, thinking about the future." Grace's expression softened. "What about it?" Daniel took a deep breath. "Our future." Together, he shifted to face her more directly. "These past months have been the happiest I can remember, Grace. You've helped me find a peace I thought was lost to me forever." Grace squeezed his hand encouragingly, her eyes never leaving his face. "I know it hasn't been long," Daniel continued, "but I've lived enough to recognize what matters. And what matters to me is you, your happiness, your well-being, the life we might build together." He reached into his pocket with his free hand, withdrawing a small velvet box. "Grace Sinclair, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" He opened the box to reveal a simple but elegant ring, a small diamond flanked by 2 sapphires set in gold. It had cost a significant portion of his savings, but seeing Grace's expression as she looked at it, Daniel knew it had been worth every penny. "Oh, Daniel," she breathed, her eyes filling with tears. Yes, I will marry you." Daniel slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that trembled slightly, then pulled her into an embrace that spoke of all the love and gratitude he felt. When they finally drew apart, Grace was smiling through her tears. "I never expected this," she admitted, looking down at the ring on her finger. "When I came west, I thought I'd left any chance of marriage behind in Boston, along with the life I'd planned with James. I was content with my work, with making a difference here." She looked up at him, her expression luminous. "But this it's more than I dared hope for." Daniel understood perfectly. He had similarly resigned himself to a solitary existence, believing it was what he deserved after the war. Finding Grace, and with her, the possibility of a shared future, felt like a gift he hadn't earned but was profoundly grateful to receive. "When shall we be married?" he asked, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Grace considered the question. "I'd like a fall wedding," she decided. "When the aspens turn gold, it's the most beautiful time in the valley." 6 weeks from now, then," Daniel calculated. "That seems both too long and not long enough to prepare." Grace laughed, the sound echoing across the water. "Mabel will insist on handling most of the arrangements, I expect. She's been not so subtly dropping hints about wedding plans for weeks now." "Has she indeed?" Daniel asked with a grin. "And here I thought I was being discreet about my intentions." "Daniel," Grace said fondly, "the entire town has been expecting this announcement since about a week after you returned from Helena. Silver Creek may be growing, but it's still small enough that very little goes unnoticed, especially a romance between the town doctor and the handsome newcomer who saved her from a flooding creek." Daniel chuckled, shaking his head at the transparency of small town life. "Well, I hope they approve of the match." "They do," Grace assured him. "Very much so. Hank Willis has been your particular champion, telling anyone who would listen what a fine addition you've been to the community with your freight business." "Hank's been a good friend," Daniel acknowledged. "One of many I've found here." He gazed at Grace, still marveling that this extraordinary woman had agreed to share her life with him. "But you, Grace Sinclair, are the best thing that's ever happened to me. "And you to me, Daniel Blackburn," she replied softly. "From the moment you pulled me from that river and said, 'Hold on,' my life changed in ways I never could have imagined." They remained by the waterfall for much of the afternoon, talking about their future plans, a home of their own on the edge of town, perhaps children someday, the continued growth of both Grace's medical practice and Daniel's freight business. When they finally rowed back to Silver Creek, the setting sun cast their joined shadows far ahead of them on the trail, as if offering a glimpse of the shared path that stretched before them. News of their engagement spread through Silver Creek with predictable speed. By the following morning, it seemed every resident had heard and formed an opinion overwhelmingly positive about the upcoming nuptials. Mabel Johnson did indeed take charge of the wedding preparations with an enthusiasm that both amused and relieved the busy couple. The 6 weeks before the wedding passed in a blur of activity. Daniel's freight business continued to grow, requiring the purchase of additional wagons and the hiring of more drivers. Grace's medical practice remained as demanding as ever, with a particularly busy season of harvesting accidents and autumn fevers. Despite their full schedules, they managed to find time for planning their future together. They purchased a piece of land on the eastern edge of town, 2 acres, with a view of the mountains, and commissioned a local builder to construct a home that would accommodate both their needs. It would have a separate examining room for Grace's practice, a study for Daniel's business records, and plenty of space for the family they hoped to have someday. As Grace had predicted, the aspens turned a brilliant gold as October arrived, transforming the surrounding mountains into a tapestry of autumn colors. On the morning of their wedding day, the sky dawned clear and cool, perfect weather for the outdoor ceremony planned in the town square. Daniel stood before the hastily constructed arbor, freshly shaved and wearing a new suit ordered from Helena for the occasion. Beside him stood Tom Patterson, who had agreed to serve as his best man, and the minister from the local church who would perform the ceremony. The entire town seemed to have turned out for the event. Rows of chairs had been arranged in a semicircle, and every seat was filled. Daniel recognized faces that had become familiar over the past months. Hank Willis, looking uncomfortable but proud in a clean shirt and string tie. Mabel Johnson, beaming with satisfaction at the culmination of her planning efforts. Mr. Jenkins from the general store, who had closed his business for the afternoon to attend. Even old Dr. Fredericks was present, his initial skepticism about Grace's abilities long since transformed into professional respect and personal regard. Beside him sat Sarah Fletcher, her baby boy now a sturdy 4-month-old bouncing on her lap, a living testament to Grace's skill and dedication. As the appointed hour arrived, a hush fell over the gathering. From the direction of Grace's office came the small procession first, Eliza Patterson as matron of honor, carrying a bouquet of autumn wildflowers, followed by the Patterson children scattering golden aspen leaves along the path. And then Grace appeared, and Daniel's breath caught in his throat. She wore a gown of ivory silk, simple yet elegant, with her hair swept up in a style that emphasized the graceful line of her neck. Her father had sent the dress from Boston when informed of the engagement, a gesture of reconciliation and acceptance that had moved Grace deeply. As she walked toward him, her eyes fixed on his, Daniel was struck by the journey that had brought them to this moment. A chance encounter during a storm. A river that rose faster than they could run. A decision to help to hold on to save a stranger's life. How different things might have been if he had taken another trail that day, if the storm had passed an hour earlier or later, if the river had been a foot lower. But here they were, about to join their lives as husband and wife. As Grace reached him and placed her hand in his, Daniel felt a certainty that transcended the vagaries of chance. This was meant to be not by some predetermined fate, but by the choices they had each made to be open to possibility, to connection, to love. The ceremony itself was brief but meaningful. They exchanged vows they had written themselves, promises not of blind devotion but of partnership, respect, and unwavering support through whatever challenges life might bring. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that rose from the assembled townspeople seemed to echo off the surrounding mountains. The celebration that followed lasted well into the evening. Tables laden with food and drink were set up in the town square, and as darkness fell, lanterns were lit, casting a warm glow over the festivities. There was music and dancing, laughter and tears, all the elements that mark the beginning of a new chapter in a community's shared story. As the night deepened, Daniel and Grace slipped away from the celebration, making their way to the room at the Silver Dollar that Mabel had insisted on preparing for their wedding night. Tomorrow they would begin their married life together in Grace's rooms above her office, while their new home was being completed. But tonight was for them alone a private affirmation of the public vows they had exchanged. Mrs. Blackburn, Daniel said softly as they entered the room, testing the sound of her new name. Grace smiled, a hint of shyness in her expression that he found endearing. "It still feels strange to hear," she admitted, "though not in a bad way. You'll always be Dr. Sinclair to your patients," Daniel assured her, understanding her concern about maintaining her professional identity. "But to me, you're Grace, my wife, my heart, my home." The words were simple but profound, an acknowledgement of the transformation they had each undergone since that fateful day by the creek. Daniel had found the courage to stop running from his past and embrace a future rooted in one place, with one person. Grace had opened her carefully guarded heart to the possibility of a love she hadn't expected to find again. As they came together in the soft lamplight, their kisses and caresses spoke of both tender affection and deeper passion. For each, it was a homecoming of the soul, a recognition that in the other, they had found not just a partner, but a completion of themselves they hadn't known they were seeking. In the years that followed, Silver Creek continued to grow and prosper. Daniel's freight business expanded to include regular routes throughout the territory, bringing increased commerce and connection to the once isolated town. Grace's medical practice flourished as well, her reputation extending far beyond the valley as she pioneered innovative approaches to women's health care in frontier conditions. Their home on the edge of town became known for its warmth and hospitality, a gathering place for friends and family. In their second year of marriage, they welcomed a daughter, whom they named Elizabeth, after Grace's mother. 2 years later, a son joined the family, James Daniel, honoring both Grace's first love and the father who had become his namesake's whole world. Through joys and sorrows, triumphs and challenges, their love deepened and matured. There were difficult times, a harsh winter when freight routes were impassable for weeks, a scarlet fever epidemic that left Grace exhausted and heartbroken over the children she couldn't save, financial setbacks when a major client went bankrupt owing the freight company a substantial sum. But through it all, they faced life together, drawing strength from each other and from the community they had helped build. The promise Daniel had made that day by the creek, "Hold on," became the foundation of their shared life. They held on to each other, to their dreams, to the belief that together they could weather whatever storms might come. On the 5th anniversary of their wedding, Daniel took Grace back to the waterfall where he had proposed. They picnicked on the same flat rock, now with 2 children playing nearby under the watchful eye of Eliza Patterson, who had become a dear friend and occasional caregiver. "Do you ever think about how differently things might have turned out?" Grace asked, watching as little Elizabeth carefully examined a wildflower. "If the creek hadn't flooded that day, if you hadn't been there to pull me out," Daniel considered the question. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But then I look at our children, at the life we've built, and I can't imagine any other path that could have led here." He took her hand, his thumb caressing the wedding band that had not left her finger since the day he placed it there. "Do you have regrets?" "About staying in Silver Creek when you could have returned to Boston, had an easier life?" Grace shook her head emphatically. "Not for a moment. My life here has meaning, purpose, love." She smiled at him, the same smile that had captivated him from the beginning. Everything I need is right here." As they sat together, watching their children play in the dappled sunlight, Daniel reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment of perfect contentment. From the chaos and trauma of war through years of restless wandering to the flooding creek where he had first seen Grace being swept away each step, even the painful ones had been necessary to reach this point. The river had risen faster than they could run. But he had lifted her up, told her to hold on. And in saving her, he had ultimately saved himself, finding in her arms the home his heart had been seeking all along.